Welcome to Chapter 17 on late adulthood, physical and cognitive development. So late adulthood is considered being over the age of 65 until death. And people of late adulthood currently make up 12% of the United States population, which is a great increase from 100 years ago. In 1900, they constituted about 3% of the population, and by 2040, it's estimated that they will make up 20% of the population. So must we age and die? Well, not all organisms do die. This is a tree that's been alive for about 4,770 years. There's a tortoise that's been alive for 177 years, and this woman, Jean Calment, died at 122 years old. We know that humans have the longest lifespan of any mammal. Approximately 70 years is the lifespan. And we don't know for sure why we die or why we age, but there are 7 different theories on why we age that we're going to look at now. The first aging theory we're going to discuss is called the wear and tear theory. And this theory states that aging is due to the cumulative effects of stress and hard work. That just over life, our bodies become worn out and tired as we use them, kind of like a car as it gets older. There's really no research to support the wear and tear theory. We do know, however, that lower rates of metabolism lead to a longer life, but even the research on that is somewhat contradictory. For example, one study found that rich foods, which are usually kind of expensive, butters, lobsters, food that generally costs more money, these foods that are rich increase metabolism, which causes a shorter lifespan. Faster metabolism, shorter lifespan is the idea. However, there's another study that found that poor people die at an earlier age than the middle class or rich people. And so generally we know that poor people are not eating rich, expensive foods. So these two findings are really contradictory to each other. Maybe there's some healthy balance in between the two of not too rich, but also not too unhealthy is the key to kind of living a longer life. And then the next theory is aging by program. All animals seem to die when their program dictates. So we all have a biological clock that is set to stop at a certain age, according to this theory. It's like we're programmed from the time we're born to die at a certain age when our body's just going to stop working. We know that female humans live 30 years after their reproductive cycles, but that's not true for all animals and mammals. Most animals actually die at or before the end of their reproductive period. So evolutionary psychologists argue that the reason female humans live 30 years after their reproductive cycles on average is to take care of kids, to keep kids alive, so that mothers and grandparents and fathers and grandfathers can help to raise the children, that grandparents might have some more wisdom on how to raise the kids in a way that's healthy, and for these reasons, we stay alive longer than our reproductive period. Or the aging by program theorists argue that maybe humans have just outsmarted the evolutionary process with medicine and technology. So let's go ahead and watch a video now on the aging by program theory.
I hate death. More than 150,000 people die on this planet every freaking day, and some of those people are getting hit by buses or dying of how cute a puppy is or something, but in most cases, their bodies are just succumbing to the dirty work of aging. And I'm tired of it. And I don't want George R.R. Martin to die before he finishes his Game of Thrones series. Obviously, we all have to die eventually. I mean, it's something that we have in common with every other person who has ever lived, but some organisms can live to be very, very, very old, and scientists are beginning to understand better how they do it and what it might take for us to live to be very, very, very old. And I'm not just talking about doing squat thrusts or eating kale or whatever, glass of white wine every day, although those things probably help. I'm talking about discovering how our cells die, why they do it, how our genes make us age, and yes, how our behavior influences our longevity. So I'm like, come on, scientists, make me live forever, please. You and I are just collections of cells, albeit magnificent and really complicated collections that exist as animated blobs for a while, hopefully long enough to reproduce. And when it gets too tough for our cells to keep these masses of cells together, we die. It happens to the best of us. And also the worst of us, and also everybody in between. For humans, and for most animals, there's a process of aging that happens over the course of our lives, culminating in the buying of the proverbial farm. This process has a lovely little name, it's called senescence. And at an organismal level, we see senescence take place after our bodies reach sexual maturity. After that, we begin to lose the ability to combat physical stress and to maintain homeostasis, the internal balance of all of our organ systems and body fluid concentrations, and most importantly, we start to lose the ability to combat disease. Because technically there is no such thing as dying of old age. Everybody dies of something. But this is good news. Not all animals do this. Not all animals age this way. Some, particularly some cold-blooded animals, exhibit what's called negligible senescence. They don't lose their ability to reproduce over time, and their death rates don't necessarily increase with age. These animals basically stay at a certain level of fitness until something terrible happens to them, like a disease or predation or a really big, fast truck barreling down the road that they're about to cross. So, for instance, Galapagos tortoises have been known to live for 170 years, and lobsters can live to be 140, and the oldest quahog clam ever collected was about 405 years old. Frickin' Shakespeare was writing Hamlet when that clam was born. So that's totally unfair. Why do some animals get to start to die as soon as they reproduce, but others get a hall pass to near immortality? Scientists don't know for sure. They're trying to figure it out by studying senescence at a cellular level. And it turns out that our stupid cells have their own deaths programmed into them. Our somatic cells, the cells that aren't sperm or eggs, are constantly dividing and making copies of themselves. In fact, there are whole armies of cells being made in your body right now. In the 1960s, a young researcher named Leonard Hayflick was studying human fetal cells when he noticed that after a while, human cells just stopped dividing and then they died. He came to realize that they all quit dividing after about 50 divisions, which took around 9 months. If he put healthy dividing cells into the freezer, the division would slow down and even stop, but when he warmed them back up, they'd remember exactly where they left off and start dividing again until they got to that magic number. It was in this way that Hayflick discovered that human cells have death programmed into them. The number of times a cell can divide is now called the Hayflick limit, and although it's 50 divisions for human fetal cells grown in a culture, the number for some animals is less and for others it's more. For instance, mice, which can live for 2 or 3 years, go through anywhere from 14 to 28 divisions. A Galapagos tortoise, on the other hand, has a Hayflick limit of about 125. So there may be a correlation between an animal's average Hayflick limit and its lifespan, but as with everything in science, it is not this simple. Because even though we're always making more new duplicate cells, as we get older, that Hayflick limit gets older. Studies of people in their 80s and 90s found that their cells only divided about 20 times. So since our cells have expiration dates, we in turn also have expiration dates. By now, good scientists are asking, okay, yes, there's a limit, but what causes the limit? Turns out the answer is probably its chromosomes. A human cell quits dividing after it stops being able to completely replicate its telomeres, the little caps of non-coding DNA on the end of each chromosome that protect the genes from errors in copying. Telomeres are originally made with the help of the enzyme telomerase when we're just little zygotes. But after that, every time a cell divides, the telomeres on the chromosomes of a new cell are a tiny, tiny bit shorter than those in the parent cell. A cell reaches its Hayflick limit when the telomeres become so short that they can no longer protect the chromosomes, and the cell becomes unviable. So, why don't biologists just fiddle around with our cells and add some telomerase to the mix so that the cells can keep dividing forever? Well, there's actually a kind of cell that already does that really well. Cancer cells. Yes, cancer cells can sometimes create their own telomerase so that they can replicate indefinitely without their chromosomes getting damaged, which is why they divide like crazy and become tumors. Because of that, nobody's super anxious to start injecting people with telomerase. And in fact, one theory is that programmed cell death evolved in order to keep our tissues from undergoing explosive cancerous growth. So, senescence, one thing that we have to grapple with as mere mortals. But another thing that's keeping us from playing basketball until we're 500 is our genes. Here, research into extending longevity has focused on a little nematode called C. elegans. These little worms are really good test subjects because their lifespan's only about 14 days and they only have about 20,000 genes, so scientists have been able to pinpoint the genes that are most likely in charge of aging. In 1993, Cynthia Kenyon, a biologist at the University of California in San Francisco, found that there was just one gene that was making these worms age. It's called DAF2. And when she messed around with that gene, basically mutated it so that it didn't work, her worms started to live 28 days instead of just 14. Twice as long! If they did that for us, we would live to be like 160. And not only that, the worms were like spunky and vivacious all the way until they croaked. Kenyon also found another gene called DAF16 that has the opposite role. It keeps the worms young and healthy by regulating the production of antioxidants, germ-fighting proteins, and other things that fight off pathogens and the effects of stress. Because, you know, being a worm, stressful. So what Kenyon found is that the aging gene worked by restricting the effects of the longevity gene. And when you damage the DAF2, DAF16 just keeps on doing its business, keeping the worms young. Now, that's all well and good for the worms. I'm glad that they're having nice, long, healthy lives, but I'm not really too concerned about them. What about us? Well, in mammals, scientists have indeed found two counterparts to that nematode aging gene, and in humans, a lot of research has focused on one gene in particular that creates a growth hormone called IGF-1. When scientists silence this gene in mice, there is less cell and organ damage caused by oxidation. Organs seem to be less susceptible to cancer and other age-related illnesses, extending the mice's lifespan by up to 33%. Now, why aren't we injecting George Martin with this stuff already? Well, for now, scientists aren't ready to start exploding everybody's genes. Just because it works in mice doesn't mean it's going to work for people. But it does lead us to one more final cause of aging that scientists are investigating: calories. That's right. It turns out that even though we need calories to live and work, the calories we take in are also stimulating the aging process. Scientists have known, actually since the 1940s, that lower caloric intake leads to longer lifespans in mice and other animals, but it wasn't until recently that they put their fingers on the possible cause: that calorie intake stimulates IGF-1. How that works isn't exactly clear. In fact, it's one of the bigger mysteries in the study of aging. But one theory is that since IGF-1's ultimate job is to direct food energy toward growth, if you take in fewer calories, your metabolism shifts gears from growing to simply maintaining existing cells and bolstering your resistance to stress and disease. So getting bigger and stronger becomes less important than just staying alive. But before you put yourself on an all celery and watercress diet, don't, because again, just because something increases the lifespan for a mouse doesn't mean it's going to have the same effect on you. Are you a mouse? If you're a mouse, then do that. Scientists have been doing calorie intake studies on animals more like us, monkeys for instance, but it's tough to do longevity studies on long-lived animals because they take freaking forever because they're like not dying. The longest running human longevity study has been going since 1921, which is pretty cool. Good job doing science back in the day when our subjects were about 10 years old. Some of the kids involved in that research are indeed still kicking. Good work, folks. But as you might expect, many of the researchers have since died as well. One of the pitfalls of studying aging. So it might be a while before somebody's willing to tinker with your cell chemistry or genetic code to help you stay young and spunky forever. But in the meantime, you can take a look at your family. How old are they living to be? How long your grandparents and parents live probably accounts for about 20 to 30% of your chance of living past the ripe old age of 85. Otherwise, lifestyle choices like diet and exercise and whether or not you smoke play a pretty obvious role in longevity. Studies show that Seventh-day Adventists, always great research subjects because they're an actual religion that encourages regular exercise, vegetarianism, and refraining from smoking and alcohol, have an average lifespan of about 88 years, about 8 years longer than the average US citizen. So while our best and brightest keep researching senescence, genetics, and calorie intake, just don't smoke like Kate Moss, eat like a pig, or drink like a fish, and you may live longer than those things at least. And one final thing that you can do to increase your lifespan: go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe. Proven! We've done the research. I promise. If you have any questions or ideas or thoughts for us, please leave them below in the comments or on Facebook or Twitter. And we'll see you next time.
The next theory is called homeostatic imbalance, and we remember that homeostasis refers to the way the body tries to maintain a steady internal environment so that we're not too hot, we're not too cold, but also we can respond to different stressors appropriately. If we need to run, our heart rate increases and we go into that fight or flight response. And then the homeostasis or the homeostatic systems put us back into a steady internal environment after the fight or flight response. So this theory of homeostatic imbalance says that aging is due to a failure in the systems that regulate the proper interactions of the organs. We know that there's not actually a lot of difference in our homeostatic systems between ages when we are in a resting or normal, or sometimes it's called a quiet state, when we're not in the fight or flight mode. However, when stress occurs and we do enter into that fight or flight mode, we see the elderly's body's homeostatic system struggling to get the organs to function properly and defend against the stressor. And because of this, it might actually cause an eventual kind of gradual death if the person is not able to kind of defend themselves against whatever stressor is going on, both internally and externally. The next theory is called the cross-linkage theory of aging. So we have proteins that make up a large part of our cells, and those proteins are composed of peptides. When crosslinks are formed between peptides, the proteins are altered, often for the worse. We have something called collagen in our body, and collagen is a major connective tissue. It provides the elasticity in our skin and our blood vessels. Collagen is a protein that makes up 70% of human skin, and it's very flexible. So it is what allows the skin to snap back in place after it's been moved around. As we age, however, collagen fibers in the skin's connective tissue begin to deteriorate due to cross-linking of protein. This protein is a derivative of glucose, and the cross-linking of protein happens within the collagen fibers. So the cross-linking breaks down the skin's natural chemical structure and causes stiffening or folding in the skin, which we know better as wrinkles. The next theory is called the accumulation of metabolic waste. It's also been known as the free radical theory. It's been around for a long time, and it argues that waste products resulting from metabolism buildup in various parts of the body are actually causing cell damage. When we eat, the body takes the nutrients we need, and the metabolism gets rid of the waste. However, not all of the waste is excreted, and over time, what's left of that waste builds up in the body. The waste, also known as toxins, begins to damage our cells, and this can lead to cataracts, cholesterol buildup, osteoporosis, and even cellulite. So let's go ahead and watch a video on the accumulation of metabolic waste. The video refers to it as free radical theory, but they're basically one and the same.
Aging is an age-related decrease in viability and increase in vulnerability. It means that your capacity to respond to external stresses and your capacity to function decreases with age. You become more vulnerable to diseases. One of the major causes of mortality in the elderly is influenza, which is just a common flu. The thing with aging, of course, it entails different levels and different organs and different systems in the body, which makes it very complex and relatively difficult to study. We actually don't know much about aging in the sense of its mechanisms. Why we age, what drives the process of aging from a cellular molecular perspective is still relatively poorly understood. I mean, if you look a little evolutionary, our lifespan only recently has been so long. I mean, the lifespan 150 years ago was something like 40 years old, and 1,000 years ago was maybe 25. When our species evolved, and when most species evolved, most of the animals die one day young, so there was really no pressure or very weak pressure for us to avoid aging or to live longer. There are hypotheses, for example, that there's damage to DNA that then probably affects cell renewal and stem cells, which in turn prevents repair in the body and contributes to loss of viability. Then there's the free radical theory of aging, this idea that as mitochondria in our cells, as they burn energy with oxygen, it generates these very highly reactive compounds, which creates damaging oxidative stress, which in turn accumulates with age, and that's the cause of aging. There's also things like the telomeres. So telomeres are the tips of chromosomes, and they shorten with cell division. But because it occurs with age as well, people say, well, maybe this drives the process of aging. So after about age 30, your chances of dying double every 8 years. This is fairly standard for human populations. No matter where you're from or where you live, in a third world country, they may have higher mortality to begin with, but you still see this exponential increase in mortality. But then you have very unique creatures. One example are birds. Now, birds actually live longer than would be expected for their body size because, they can fly and avoid predators. One of the species that we're interested in is an organism called the naked mole rat, which lives over 30 years. Why? Because it lives in this protective environment. Then there is evolutionary reason, there is evolutionary pressure to live longer. One of the interesting things about the naked mole rat is that it's extremely cancer resistant. There's not been a single case of cancer in hundreds of naked mole rats. So longevity is plastic. Not only there are species that live much longer time than we do, but there are species that appear not to age, like some species of turtles. Probably one of the greatest breakthroughs in the field so far is that you can manipulate individual genes, and this has a very significant impact on aging. We know, for instance, that if you start manipulating DNA repair systems, sometimes, say, for example, in mice, you get what looks like accelerated aging. On the other hand, you can turn off a single gene in mice, like growth hormone receptor, and increase lifespan by 50%. There's also interventions that modulate aging. So the most famous of them all is caloric restriction, restricting the amount of calories animals eat while keeping nutrients like vitamins and minerals healthy. And this has been known for decades to extend lifespan in rodents, like 50%. And they're healthier for longer, and it's quite impressive. So one of the things, for instance, our lab does is, well, if you know of a gene that mediates the effects of caloric restriction, then it may be a suitable target for you to develop drugs that target that gene in order to have the same effects of caloric restriction without you having to go on a diet, which, let's face it, most people don't want to. We do a mixture of bioinformatics and experimental work. We try to look for common patterns amongst these genes as a way to try to identify new genes that modulate longevity, and we want to identify which genes are regulating the other genes, so key regulators of the whole pathways. And the thing to remember about aging in general is that it's very time-consuming and expensive to do experiments. That's one of the problems of aging research. If you could slow down the process of aging just by 7 years, this would reduce in half the incidence of age-related diseases at every single age. This would have a massive impact on human lifespan and on human health. I generally make the analogy of the Wright brothers. They used to look at birds, and they said, listen, there are birds, they are heavier than air, and they can fly. So if birds can fly, so can we make airplanes. There's no law of nature that says that aging is immutable. On the contrary, what we know now is that aging is surprisingly plastic in the sense that it can be manipulated by genes, it can be manipulated by evolution, and it can be manipulated by diet. When I was younger, I think maybe 10 years old, and I realized that everyone ages and dies. And I thought, well, why should that be? I mean, can't we do something about it? So I thought, well, I'll do it. I'll study aging and I'll figure it out and I'll find a solution for it so people don't have to age and die.
So now you have two camps of bacteria, the bad bacteria, and then we have another camp of the type of bacteria that produce metabolites for us as antibiotics.
The next theory is the autoimmunity theory of aging, which states that the process by which the immune system in the body rejects the body's own tissue as we age might be what ultimately causes our deaths. We know for sure that autoimmunity can cause arthritis, diabetes, vascular disease, and hypertension, which all can ultimately lead to our demise. The rejection of the body tissue may be due to the production of new antigens. Antigens are substances in the blood that produce antibodies, which ultimately kill them. So the idea is that when you have an autoimmune disease, your body cannot tell the difference between antibodies and antigens, and it just ends up attacking the antibodies, which damages the tissue. It's said that these new antigens can come from DNA mutations or the body not recognizing its own cells anymore as we age. The last theory is called the accumulation of errors theory. As cells die, they must synthesize new proteins to make new cells. As this is done, occasionally errors occur. Over time, these errors can mount up and may finally grow serious enough to cause organ failure and ultimately death. There are some alternative theories on aging besides the 7 that we've just discussed. There are some gene theories saying that aging is due to certain harmful genes that we're born with. Studies show that identical twins, which, as you know, have the same exact genetic code, have more similar lifespans than fraternal twins, who have different genes. Research shows that centenarians, which are people over 100, are more resistant to illnesses like cancer and heart disease, which leads to support this idea of the gene theory that maybe we're just born with good genes that keep us alive longer or don't. The next theory is the environmental theory. This theory says that aging is most likely a combination of both our genes and our environment. So it's a combination of nature and nurture. Some support for this idea is that there were no vaccines in the 1900s and we had a higher infant mortality rate. In our environment now, we do have vaccination. In other cultures, like in Africa, we know that starvation produces a shorter lifespan. There is nuclear testing done in the Pacific that's still causing people health problems. So the environment in which we live certainly takes a toll on our body and ultimately the way that we age. In addition to those kind of cultural and historical differences in our environment, currently, some environmental factors that affect aging are poverty, the foods that we eat, exposure to toxins, how much stress you have, your education level, your occupation, whether it's stressful, not stressful, how often do you work, whether you exercise or not, do you have friends, your gender, and then whether or not you are involved in any type of accident, a vending machine falling on you or getting in a car accident. We know that women live 7 years longer than men, but what's interesting and kind of odd is that women also have higher levels of autoimmune diseases, multiple sclerosis, and colon cancer. Okay, so let's watch a video that kind of combines these two theories of nature and nurture, both gene theory and environmental theories on aging.
While many search for the proverbial fountain of youth, you might be wondering, why do we age in the first place? What is it about our bodies or cells biologically that causes us to grow old? There's a variety of internal and external factors such as diet, exercise, or environmental stress which all contribute to cell damage and repair and affect the rate of aging. But the surprising truth is that, apart from these, we actually have a biological clock buried within our genetic makeup, and this clock can only run for so long. In other words, we're programmed to die. Your body is made up of trillions of cells which are constantly going through cell division, and every time they divide, they make a copy of their DNA as well. This DNA is tightly packed into structures called chromosomes, of which humans have 23 pairs. The problem is, DNA replication isn't quite perfect and skips over the end of each chromosome. To protect against important DNA information being cut out, we have something called telomeres on the end of chromosomes, which are essentially meaningless repeats of DNA that we can afford to lose. But every time our cells divide, these telomeres become shorter and shorter until eventually they've been entirely stripped away, at which point the cell no longer divides. Some flatworms are able to endlessly regenerate their telomeres, making them effectively biologically immortal. But their lifespans do vary, and they're still susceptible to disease, further suggesting that aging is a mix of genetic and environmental factors. But why don't our cells do this? Ultimately, this replication limit actually helps to prevent cancer, which is the uncontrollable growth of cells and evasion of cell death. The point at which a cell stops replicating is known as cellular senescence. In humans, this replication limit is around 50 times. Once it's reached, the cell gradually begins to lose its function and die, causing age-related characteristics. This also helps to explain why life expectancy is a strongly heritable trait from your parents, because you got your initial telomere length from them. Got a burning question you want answered? Ask it in the comments or on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe for more weekly science videos.
Okay, go ahead and pause the video here, head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 1, and when you've finished, return to this point in the lecture. See you then. Alright, let's talk about physical development in late adulthood. So the first kind of difference that we see in late adults than we see in younger adults is reaction time. And reaction time is the time between the onset of a stimulus and the actual muscle activity that indicates a reaction to it. This reaction time does slow as we age, especially as it relates to manual dexterity. Manual dexterity is using our hands and fingers and arms and legs, being able to use our fine and gross motor skills. Some people argue that this slowing down of reaction time might be what causes elderly people to get into more car accidents than they did when they were younger. And so there is a debate on whether or not people in late adulthood, especially over the age of 75, should be allowed to drive or not. So let's go ahead and watch a video on that debate.
The issue of when an older driver should give up their licence is fraught with emotion, and for Southport MP Peter Lawler, the topic is a deeply personal one. He's called for a parliamentary inquiry after his daughter lost her leg in a car accident. The state government set up an advisory committee and isn't ruling out annual medical tests for elderly drivers. Emma Pollard reports.
A shocking event on May the 11th changed the life of Peter Lawler and his daughter.
I got a call from my son-in-law Clive to say that there'd been an accident and that my daughter and my grandson were involved.
Ali France was in the car park of her local shopping centre in Brisbane when a driver lost control, pinning her against another car. She managed to push her 4-year-old son out of the way.
One lady grabbed Zach out of the stroller and raced off with him so he didn't see, what was happening to his mother.
As the mother of two stood there trapped and bleeding heavily, the elderly driver froze. 2 young men who witnessed the accident immediately went to help.
They got the car off Ali and then one of them took his shirt off and put a tourniquet on her leg. Otherwise, without that, she probably would have bled to death on the spot.
Doctors couldn't save the 38-year-old's left leg, which was amputated above the knee. Mr Lawler says his daughter harbours no resentment toward 88-year-old Ronald Petfield, who was behind the wheel that morning.
Is there anything you want to say to the family?
No.
Last week, he pleaded guilty to driving without due care and attention.
He was convicted and disqualified absolutely from driving, but not further punished.
Peter Lawler has called for a parliamentary inquiry into older drivers, and he wants Parliament to consider the introduction of regular driving tests for over 75s.
But it's not good enough, in my view, to allow people to continue to drive until they have a serious accident.
It's a divisive issue. 83-year-old Val French leads the lobby group Older People Speak Out. She still drives and is firmly against driving tests for seniors.
I don't agree that it would have any benefit, quite frankly. I think it's very discriminatory because there are a tremendous number of accidents, and you would be aware of that, that are perpetrated by youth, by people in the middle, as well as accidents by older people.
It's an argument supported by Department of Transport figures, which show older drivers aren't overrepresented in road crashes.
I am fed to the teeth with this idea that older people are different from the rest of the community.
At the moment, drivers aged 75 and over need to carry a certificate from a doctor. The certificate can include conditions and can be valid for up to 5 years. While Ms French is against physical driving tests, she does believe older drivers should have more frequent medical tests.
At the moment, some people are only being tested every, say, three years or just once in the 5 years. We've got to get rid of that and make sure that we are doing it far more regularly.
She says for some people, closing the door on driving can be devastating.
Once they're told they can't drive anymore, they will go downhill because they've lost their wings, haven't they?
General practitioner Dr Richard Kidd is at the front line of the debate. He regularly completes driving certificates for elderly patients and supports the current system.
And it comes down to the doctor's discretion, and I think that's the best thing.
He says the strong personal bonds between GPs and patients are a help, not a hindrance, when driving is discussed.
I've certainly found that closeness, that trust that's built up over the years has been really good, where I've had the conversation with patients, and most people I've found have been very receptive to the concerns that I raise.
Russell White has worked in driver training for 20 years. The road safety advocate puts drivers of all ages through their paces in his simulator.
So Emma, if you're all set, we might take you for a drive. So when you're ready, hit the start button and we'll hit the road.
He says while older people generally take road safety very seriously, they can have physical challenges which affect their driving.
A senior driver will tend to bring their eyes back even further and be looking immediately in front of the bonnet. Now, and of course that's generally speaking, but that's largely what you tend to see. They simply don't move their head or move their eyes anywhere as near as much as they should.
He's pushing for all drivers to receive ongoing training.
We're sort of asking a lot for it to be done at both ends and nothing in the middle. And if you really look at any other form of work or training, that doesn't happen anywhere else. There's always a period of ongoing development.
Training is one issue likely to be discussed by a new advisory committee announced by the Transport Minister.
This is the first step, and then we'll be looking at recommendations, and I'll be taking that to Cabinet.
The Minister has flagged the possibility of annual medical tests for elderly drivers.
Other states have gone through a model now where they're looking at for general practitioners to test a person every year to make sure that they are fit and proper. That's something I'm open to. It's something that we can look at and explore.
It falls short of Peter Lawler's call for a parliamentary inquiry, but he's satisfied the government is at least taking the issue seriously.
The independence of an individual shouldn't outweigh the safety of the community.
Mr. Lawler says his daughter is recovering and he hopes this doesn't happen to another family.
And the government has also announced a review of the practical test for learner drivers.
Some people argue that the reason our reaction time slows down in late adulthood may be due to neural changes, so the changes that are going on in our brain as brain cells die, but also depression, anxiety, motivation, and ageism have also all been found to be linked to the slowing of our reaction times. Ageism is the prejudice that the elderly are inferior to those who are younger. And so when elderly people are being treated in a less competent way, they might then be behaving accordingly. It can sort of be a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. If someone keeps constantly telling you can't do something, you can't do something, maybe eventually you start to believe it. The next thing that we're going to talk about are sensory abilities and physical development. So our sensory abilities slow in part due to biological factors, also to lack of sensory stimulation later in life. We just don't get out as much. We're not using our five senses quite as much as we were when we were younger. And the slowing down of our sensory abilities has also been related to psychosocial factors such as depression, loneliness, and stress. So let's start with vision. We know that as our eyes age, the lens in the eye lets in less light. It becomes thicker and more transparent. It becomes less elastic and leads to farsightedness, which is the ability to see far but not up close. This reduction in vision, or this sudden change in eyesight, almost never occurs before the age of 60. So it's certainly related to getting older. There's also something called floaters that people in late adulthood see more of. And floaters are particles stuck in the jelly substance of the eyes. It's not really problematic. It doesn't really mean anything in terms of loss of vision or blindness, unless it's accompanied by flashes of light. If you're suddenly seeing flashes of light, this may actually be a sign of retinal detachment. And of course, if your retina detaches from the back of your eye, you would in fact go blind. Another issue that late adults deal with in vision is dry eye, which is due to diminished eye production. That's a really easy fix. You just get some Visine and you're good to go. Cataracts is the leading cause of blindness. It causes cloudiness of the lens. It can be painful. And then there is glaucoma, which is a disease that results from pressure caused by excess fluid in the eye. It's asymptotic, which means that there's really no symptoms, so it's very important to get eyes checked to see if you are in fact developing glaucoma, because if it goes untreated, it can lead to blindness. In terms of hearing, we know that people are actually less willing to wear hearing aids than they are to wear glasses. In fact, there's an average gap between the loss of hearing and getting a hearing aid that is on average between 5 and 7 years. Age-related hearing loss is one of the most common health problems of the elderly, and generally it's considered to be due to noise exposure over the lifespan. We have these tiny little hairs on the inner ear, which we've talked about before. They're called cilia, C-I-L-I-A, and they shake as our ears catch the sound waves. They pick up the vibration. And if the vibration is too strong because the music is too loud, this can cause the cilia to shatter. And once the cilia shatters and goes away, it does not grow back. And without cilia, you cannot hear. Hearing loss is also more common in men than it is in women. So a similar thing happens to the cilia inside of our nose as we age. We know that age contributes to the atrophy of the olfactory nerves in the nose, and this is because the cilia are attached to those nerves in the nose that allow us to smell. And so over time of sniffing and blowing our nose and picking our noses, we start to lose those cilia, and then our olfactory nerves can't really work, and eventually they begin to diminish or atrophy. Taste is really closely connected with smell. It's actually been said that 95% of taste depends on our ability to smell. And so if someone becomes anosmic or can no longer smell, it's likely that they will not be able to taste. In addition to that, we know that young adults have 250 taste buds, whereas the elderly generally have no more than 100 taste buds. So eventually our taste buds also atrophy, diminish, go away. Our skeletal systems are also affected by age. They're fully formed by the time we're 24, but then as we age, the skeletal systems become tighter and stiffer, and this tightening and stiffening actually causes the elderly to shrink a little in height. Collagen in the bones decreases due to diseases like arthritis, and that can actually be very painful. There's another skeletal system disease that we see very common in the elderly known as osteoporosis, and this is a disease that causes low bone density. So let's go ahead and watch a video now on osteoporosis.
The bones are important components which leverage and provide support to the human body. They are composed of calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. Bones generally hold 99% of the body's calcium. Osteoporosis, or porous bone, is characterized by low bone mass and structural deterioration of bone tissue, which leads to bone fragility and increased susceptibility to fractures of the hip, spine, and wrist. Two essential cells are involved in the daily turnover of the bone: osteoblast cells and osteoclast cells. Overactivity of the osteoclast cells leads to osteoporosis. There are two types of osteoporosis: primary and secondary osteoporosis. Primary osteoporosis is in turn divided into type 1 and type 2. Symptoms of osteoporosis are swelling and joint pain, fracture, disfigurement and debilitation, and kyphosis. Osteoporosis can be diagnosed by bone densitometry, ultrasound, and by quantitative computed tomography. Osteoporosis can be treated by changes in lifestyle, like quitting smoking, regular exercise, a balanced diet, and by taking medications such as estrogen replacement therapy, biphosphonates, alendronate and risidronate, or synthetic calcitonin or parathyroid hormone supplements.
So skin is also affected by age because the stretching of collagen in the skin over time causes the skin to become loose and lose its elasticity. And this can create wrinkles, brown spots, and even coarseness of the skin, so it's not quite as soft as it once was. When we have dark circles under the eye, this actually develops due to the skin becoming more pale than due to any other reason. And we know that we lose fat cells in late adulthood that create pressure on the skin. And once we lose those fat cells, we don't have that pressure on the skin anymore, which causes the skin to fold, sag, and wrinkle. Let's go ahead and watch a video on the effects of aging on our skin.
To understand how we visibly age, it helps to understand the anatomy of the skin. Two features many people recognize are hair follicles and sweat glands. The outer or superficial layer of the skin is called the epidermis. Underneath that, shown here in brown, is the dermis. The epidermis contains elastin, which gives young skin elasticity and enables it to quickly recover its shape. The sweat glands, which contain and release moisture, are also important for youthful skin, as is the blood supply. But a lot of unprotected sun exposure, even when you're young, can dry out the skin. Surface cracks allow even more moisture to escape, and damaged skin produces less elastin, which contributes to wrinkle formation. Using the right kind of sunblock or sunscreen can help to prevent further damage. The sun gives off several kinds of rays, including UVA and UVB. Both can damage skin. The skin on the left is protected from both, but the skin on the right is not protected against UVAs, which continue to damage tissues. This prompts cells in the epidermis to release melanin, which darkens the skin. A lot of exposure results in sunburn, which causes the release of more melanin to protect the skin and leads to sunspots and freckles. Using the wrong kinds of soaps can also age skin by stripping away the thin protective coating called the acid mantle. Cigarette smoke promotes skin cracks and wrinkles because it reduces levels of nitric oxide, a cellular gas that helps keep skin flexible. Many women use an exfoliating agent to debride or scrape off dead skin cells. Some agents become smaller or dissolve as they're used, which can help prevent overuse or damage while still leaving young, healthy material. Hydration is also important. Ideally, the solution will penetrate the pores and keep them small while also plumping up the epidermis.
Some elderly wear dentures, which is actually correlated with having a lower self-esteem. However, the reason that they would have to wear these dentures is usually due to gum disease rather than tooth decay, which is very easily preventable if you floss, go to the dentist regularly, and use fluoride. In terms of our hair, the main reason that we experience changes in our hair is because of the hormonal changes that we go through as we age. And so some of the changes we see in the hair are thinning, baldness, grayness, stiffness, and women start to develop some facial hair as they get into late adulthood commonly. The thinning or balding of the hair also has genetic features attached to it. It's something known as male pattern baldness, which actually comes from the mother's side of the family. And then finally, in terms of the gastric system, digestive problems in late adulthood are common. One of the most common is ulcers and constipation. Research shows that reducing stress tends to be effective in reducing any type of digestive problems in old age. In terms of our health, there's really two major causes of concern in late adulthood: prostate cancer and Alzheimer's disease. So prostate cancer is the most common form of cancer in men and the second leading cause of death in men. African American males have a higher rate of prostate cancer than white men, and males over 65 account for 80% of the men diagnosed with prostate cancer, so it's much more common in late adulthood. We know that the risk is greater if a lot of your relatives also had prostate cancer, so this indicates that it might be genetic or hereditary. Also, diets with few fruits and veggies, but that are high in fat, increases the likelihood of the development of prostate cancer. Heavy drinkers, which is defined as someone who has more than 22 drinks per week, had a 40% greater risk than light drinkers, one study found. Even light smoking can increase the risk of prostate cancer. But people who exercise and burn 4,000 calories per week on average cut their risk of prostate cancer in half. So exercise is a great form of preventative medicine. Okay, let's go ahead and watch a video on prostate cancer.
With Father's Day here to remind us just how much we care about our dads, we thought we'd take a look at an issue related to men. Prostate cancer is the second largest cause of cancer deaths in men in both America and the UK. The prostate is part of the male reproductive system and responsible for making seminal fluid, which turns out to be partly responsible for, you guessed it, creating you and everyone else. But with time and age, the cells in the prostate, like any other cells, can pick up defects which lead to cancer. Now, your body and everything in it, including the prostate, is made up of cells. Normal behaving cells go through the cell cycle in which they grow and divide into duplicate cells through a process known as mitosis. But instead of just duplicating uncontrollably, there are numerous measures along the way to make sure these cells are healthy, functioning normally, and replicating at a controlled rate. For example, cells not only receive growth signals, they actually receive anti-growth signals to tell them when to stop growing altogether. On top of this, cells actually have a limited replicative capacity, meaning the more they replicate, the less chance they have to do it again. Finally, cells are generally localized to an area in the body and require angiogenesis, or blood vessel creation, to sustain their life and bring them nutrients. Move the cell away from this and it can't survive. Any cells that aren't following these rules or that are old and worn out are often removed by a process known as apoptosis. Apoptosis is the controlled destruction or breakdown of cells by the body. But every now and then, a mutation or error may occur which changes the cell's properties. For example, it may pick up the ability to ignore anti-growth signals in one generation, and later down the line, one of these cells may mutate to be able to evade apoptosis. These mutations are random and happen by chance, but it's the combination of a few of them that in the end leads to fast-growing, uncontrollably duplicating, immortalized masses of cells, also known as cancer. Which explains why the older you are, the more likely you are to get prostate cancer, because your cells have had many more chances to pick up multiple mutations through many generations of cells. This is one of the reasons that about 80% of men will get prostate cancer by the time they're 80. So is there anything we can do about it? In some ways, yes. If we look at Asia, we see some of the lowest prostate cancer numbers across the globe, so we might think it's genetic, and many studies support this. But interestingly, Asian men who have moved to America show a higher incidence of prostate cancer than those in Asia, in proportion to how long they've been in America. On top of this, American-born babies of Asian descent have nearly the same incidence of prostate cancer as Caucasian babies born in America. This clearly illustrates that some of the contributing factors must be diet and lifestyle based. As it turns out, some studies have shown foods like soy, tomatoes, and fish may be partly responsible for this decrease, though there is still much debate. These foods, as well as a few chemicals and medications, all have properties which may aid in normal cell regulation or prevent cell damage and mutation. On the other hand, fatty foods have been noted as potential culprits towards many cancers. At the end of the day, even though there still remains uncertainty surrounding prostate cancer and how to prevent or treat it, education and understanding are of great value. So instead of giving your dad a card this Father's Day, grab a tomato in one hand, some soy in the other, and give him the greatest gift in life: knowledge. Because the more we encourage each other to learn and live a healthy and active life, the better off we'll be. And the more we think about how our conscious choices affect our lives now and later, the greater our quality of life can become. Happy Father's Day.
There are two common forms of dementia that become prevalent in late adulthood, and they are Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. Vascular dementia is due to decreased blood flow to the brain, which can occur as we age. Women over 65 are more likely to develop Alzheimer's than men, and the risk increases significantly after the age of 75. However, there's really no gender difference in vascular dementia. It seems to affect both men and women the same. We know that Alzheimer's disease has a genetic cause, and we've actually been able to identify the gene that causes Alzheimer's. However, there still is currently no cure. The course of the disease can last anywhere from 6 to 20 years, and symptoms include a slow and steady deterioration of learning and memory, and also some pretty dramatic changes in behavior often occur. An interesting fact about Alzheimer's is that almost all people with Down syndrome also develop Alzheimer's. Okay, let's watch a video that will describe more about what Alzheimer's is and how it creates the symptoms that it does.
What is Alzheimer's disease? Alzheimer's is a slow, fatal disease of the brain affecting 1 in 10 people over the age of 65. No one is immune. The disease comes on gradually as 2 abnormal protein fragments called plaques and tangles accumulate in the brain and kill brain cells. They start here in the hippocampus, the part of the brain where memories are first formed. Over many years' time, the plaques and tangles slowly destroy the hippocampus, and it becomes harder and harder to form new memories. Simple recollections from a few hours or days ago that the rest of us might take for granted are just not there. After that, more plaques and tangles spread into different regions of the brain, killing cells and compromising function wherever they go. This spreading around is what causes the different stages of Alzheimer's. From the hippocampus, the disease spreads here to the region of the brain where language is processed. When that happens, it gets tougher and tougher to find the right word. Next, the disease creeps toward the front of the brain, where logical thought takes place. Very gradually, a person begins to lose the ability to solve problems, grasp concepts, and make plans. Next, the plaques and tangles invade the part of the brain where emotions are regulated. When this happens, the patient gradually loses control over moods and feelings. After that, the disease moves to where the brain makes sense of things it sees, hears, and smells. In this stage, Alzheimer's wreaks havoc on a person's senses and can spark hallucinations. Eventually, the plaques and tangles erase a person's oldest and most precious memories, which are stored here in the back of the brain. Near the end, the disease compromises a person's balance and coordination, and in the very last stage, it destroys the part of the brain that regulates breathing and the heart. The progression from mild forgetting to death is slow and steady, and takes place over an average of 8 to 10 years. It is relentless and, for now, incurable. Helping your family, friends, and neighbors to better understand Alzheimer's will reduce stigma, improve care, and even help the fight for a cure. Thanks for helping to do your part. Learn more at www.aboutalz.org.
So, as you know, the relationship between physical and mental health is reciprocal. We understand this on the most basic of levels, that if we're sad, we have the physical reaction of crying. If we're nervous, we have the physical reaction of shaking. If we're embarrassed, we have the physical reaction of turning red or blushing. But most people don't really understand the extent of this relationship. The idea is that the mind and the body really should not be viewed as separate entities because they work together to keep each other healthy or not healthy. They affect each other, in other words. For example, depression can cause migraines, stomach aches, muscle tension, and sleep disturbances. And so because of this, our mental state really does affect how we age. We know that white men in late adulthood that live alone and use alcohol and have had depression in the past is the group in the U.S. that is at the greatest risk of suicide of all other ages. Women in late adulthood who have become single, either due to divorce or death of a spouse or loved one or partner, and have medical problems are at a high risk of suicide. Older adults with depression are more likely to have poor health and cognitive functioning, and they're also more likely to endure physical disability. Some of the medications that they take can lead to issues with mental health, and some of the things that older adults do to deal with these issues of mental health is engage in drinking as a way to self-medicate, and that can be very dangerous when it's mixed in combination with whatever prescription drugs they are on. So let's go ahead and take a look now at depression and suicide in late adulthood, as it is the most common age when suicide occurs.
A study by the UC Davis Department of Psychiatry says older men are less likely than women to seek treatment for depression. The problem of undertreatment in older men has received little attention. Medical conditions such as heart disease, stroke, and cancer are more prevalent in older adults. Some medications for those illnesses come with side effects that can lead to depression and memory loss.
I can't think because all the medication, I'll be darned, it kind of scares me.
Helen Varys Mitchell is being treated for pneumonia, complicated by congestive heart failure.
That's awful not to remember. That's why they have to eradicate some of these diseases some way. Because seniors, if they're healthy, I could remember everything. That's sad for me. That's the saddest thing.
Memories preserve pictures of the past and open doors to the future. Now, new findings reveal that untreated depression can lead to dementia.
If one is depressed in younger life and in older life, then one's chances of developing a dementia increase by about 50%. So it's a high risk factor for the development of dementia. And the longer it goes untreated, the more harm it does.
Don Reynolds has struggled with depression most of his adult life. He's been on antidepressants for 25 years and regularly gets counseling.
I've managed my depression pretty well and been quite stable for a long time. And one thing that's been very important for me is coming to terms with depression, not being embarrassed by it or accepting it as kind of part of my life, and then managing with it and finding ways to have a satisfactory life.
There is a definite brain chemistry thing going on with people who have clinical depression, where half of them will respond very positively to these substances that increase their serotonin in their brains. So it's like diabetes with insulin being off. Similarly, with depression, the serotonin is off.
For the most part, I've disguised or kept my depression to myself and smiled even when I didn't feel like smiling.
Believe it or not, smiling for the sake of smiling is not a bad thing. And doing nice things for yourself, scientists say, generates a sense of self-worth and well-being.
Applying cognitive behavioral therapy techniques could be simplified with older adults to where if they do 4 consciously chosen, deliberately done activities a day that are pleasurable, it'll keep the blues away. Plain and simple.
Like Don, the majority of older adults improve with treatment. For everyone of all ages, exercising, eating well, and managing stress will help prevent depression.
I've always exercised and I'm careful with my eating.
Clea Myers is, get this, 91 years old. She lives in a retirement community and believes the social interaction keeps her physically and mentally fit.
I've been here 11 years, and one thing I always tell people, don't just sit. Get out and open your door, and you're going to meet somebody and say hello or good morning, how are you? And immediately you find you're lifted and have a conversation, something going. Keep involved.
Bill Peniston says his loyal companion these days is 14-year-old Bobsy.
I think she's a very sweet little dog who's very attached to me.
Not that long ago, Bill's wife of more than 50 years was moved into a memory care facility. Since then, he's relied on Bobsy to keep his spirits up.
It's wonderful medicine, some of the best medicine in the world. Oh yeah, yeah. No, she's my sweetheart. Yeah, I'm very fond of her.
So due to longer life expectancies, many older adults are taking on a different career instead of retiring. Some psychologists refer to this as the phase or period of life called rehirement. And we find elderly adults doing part-time work, and when we ask them why, they often say because they needed to reinvent themselves or have a way to stay mentally and physically active, so they'd rather work than retire and be alone and bored. Social factors are considered the main factor in health in the later years, more so even than physical factors. And so working allows people to be social, to keep their minds active, and this is why some elderly adults opt for this. Research shows that women's self-concept is more affected by their aging physical appearance than men's self-concept is. And this may be due to what's known as the double standard in aging. Men, as they age, are considered more distinguished, silver foxes, where as women age, they're considered to be growing old or old maids. Due to this, women are more concerned with maintaining a youthful appearance than men are. Women are also more likely to exercise, eat healthy, and pay attention to things like clothing and makeup, cosmetics, and even cosmetic surgery. And so this may be due to this idea of the double standard in aging. Okay, go ahead and pause the video here, go to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 2, and when you've finished, return to this point in the video. A lot of people assume that as we age, our cognitive abilities just cease to work anymore. But the truth is, the effects of old age on cognitive ability are not all that bad. Older adults actually have greater global awareness than younger adults, and they get an increase in vocabulary as they age. The brain makes up for the cell loss that we have as we age by making new connections with the remaining cells. Some of the ways that we can get our brain to make more neural connections is with aerobics, good nutrition, mental exercises. All of this can increase those neural connections and slow cognitive decline. However, some cognitive abilities do in fact decline in late adulthood. For example, elderly people take longer to learn a new language and they have a harder time multitasking. Mental illness like dementia and untreated diabetes can also limit cognitive ability. In terms of creativity, research shows that creativity does decline with age. However, older adults with higher self-esteem actually have less a decline in creativity. And whether or not a person will be creative is influenced at a young age way more than it's influenced at an older age. Only about 5% of elderly people have a creative burst or suddenly become creative once they're past the age of 65. A creativity burst in late adulthood is most likely to happen between the ages of 60 to 65, but it's important to note that that is very, very rare. Most of our creative abilities are determined at a very young age and then remain consistent throughout our lives. Finally, in terms of wisdom, wisdom is defined as superior insight and judgment that can only come from experience. And researchers say that wisdom is the result of 5 factors. The first is both fluid and crystallized intelligence. The second is personality traits such as open-mindedness, resilience, and generativity. Life experience is the third factor in wisdom. Age, and then finally social intelligence. So the higher you are on all 5 of these factors, the more wise you're likely to be. Alright, that's it for this chapter. Don't forget to do the journal and form assignments on Moodle, and we'll see you next time. Have a good day.